Welcome, everyone. I'm Teresa Mangum. I'm the director of the Obermann Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Iowa. And I am delighted that we were honored that Jodi Skipper chose to publish her book with us in the series that Annie Balk and I co-edit called Humanities and Public Life from the University of Iowa Press. Thank you for coming. You have an exciting discussion ahead of you, and I'll turn things over to Annie to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. And it's so nice to have so many people here today for what I know is going to be a really rich and stimulating conversation. So just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. The program today is being recorded, as you probably know when you entered the Zoom, and it will be available through the Obermann Center after the program ends. I encourage people to ask questions in the chat during the presentation or to wait. We will leave time at the end for a Q&A. So either way works. What we're going to do today, I'm going to very briefly introduce the three presenters on our roundtable. After some very brief introductions, I'm going to turn it over to them to tell you more about their projects. And then we will have some free-flowing but kind of structured conversation about a number of issues related to all of their work that they are eager to talk about with you. And then we'll have some time for a larger conversation. So today we're going to start off with Jodi Skipper. Jodi is a professor of anthropology and Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi, where her research and teaching focus on African American historic sites and heritage tourism. She's the author of the brand new, less than a month ago, book that Teresa mentioned, Behind the Big House, Reconciling Slavery, Race, and Heritage in the U.S. South. And that is the occasion for our gathering today. After Jodi, we'll have a chance to hear from Joby Hill. Joby is a preservation architect and founder of the Saving Slave House Project, which focuses on preserving extant slave houses and educating the public about their significance. And we're really thrilled to have Joby here. She's on the verge of a big move to North Carolina this weekend, so we really appreciate her making the time for this discussion today. And then finally, we'll hear from Andrea Roberts. Andrea is a professor of landscape architecture and urban planning at Texas A&M University, and I just heard on her way to Charlottesville to begin a new position at UVA in the fall. Andrea is also the founder and director of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, which is an effort to document more than 500 settlements across the state of Texas. And she'll be speaking more about that. So let me turn it over to Jodi to get us started.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Annie, and thanks to everyone on the other end for viewing and being here and taking the time out to share with us today. I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation with Joby Hill and Andrea Roberts, whose work I admire immensely, and I'm excited that you get to hear about theirs as well if you haven't already. I've been working with this slave dwelling interpretation program called Behind the Big House since 2012. It's a project that was started by a couple of private homeowners, Chilius Carter and Jennifer Eggleston, who started to think about what it means to include the lives of enslaved people on the tourism landscape and also on the educational and historical narrative landscape in the state of Mississippi, where it's not that evident. So there are certainly antebellum histories through a lot of historic pilgrimages that tend to focus on a lot of the main houses and their furnishings, but not much in terms of holistic interpretations about enslaved people. And what Chilius and Jennifer eventually figured out is that this kitchen unit on their property was a slave dwelling in which enslaved people lived, at least beginning in the 1850s, maybe earlier than that. And even after freedom, you had folks who are considered African American who occupied that particular former slave dwelling until at least 1910. So we've got a history of slavery to freedom on this one site. And it's a very rich and intricate story. But what's very unique about it is that it is part of this grassroots community historic interpretation program, something that we don't have many of in the US. So we didn't have a model when we started this program. I came in on the second year. Chilius and Jennifer had done a lot of the legwork with Joseph McGill Jr., some of you may know, who started a slave cabin project, now a slave dwelling project in 2010, and helped them. And since then, we've had several other volunteers come in, and also some community human resource support. It's an all volunteer effort that I'm, again, very proud to be a part of, but also very proud to have had the opportunity to archive in some way through this book. And before I talk more about my specific relationship to the program and also to other organizations and institutions related to this work, I do want to show a clip from the Lens Collective. The Lens Collective is actually this particular program that Alicia Steele, a colleague of mine in the journalism department at the University of Mississippi, developed as a way to get students from different parts of the country to come to the state of Mississippi and then do quick research. So relatively in one day, produce films and then show those films the next day. And we were so privileged to have, I think, 3 of those films done in Holly Springs. I'll show one, and I think that someone also placed a link in the chat to that Lens Collective for you so that you could see some more of that work. And then also one in Oxford, Mississippi, my university's home, that also talks about African-American heritage and interpretations in North Mississippi. So I'll share that now, and then I'll talk a little bit more.
It's rare that you have a lot of personal information on enslaved people because, for one thing, they weren't really considered whole people at that time. They're considered on the same category as livestock. Where do you think all this money, it's a lot of money, where do you think all this money came from? It's like, well, banks down here, southern, rich people. Most of this money comes from up north, European banks too. Everybody got their hands dirty. Cotton's a very labor-intensive crop, and that's where you get to the scores and scores of slaves up into the hundreds. Just depends on how much land you got. There's a phrase that was coined by a European visitor that came to North Mississippi called Mississippi Madness. We didn't make that up. That's his phrase. We're finding that the smaller cottages that are in town, the little 3 or 4 room cottages, not the big houses, but the small cottages, they generally had from 1 to 3 enslaved people there. So you figure a yard person, a cook, and someone took care of the house. There's a reason why the slave quarters, the kitchen, all the structures that the enslaved people worked out of were behind the big house. Those were all domestic things going on that you did not want out in public view. You got chopping wood because, this is a wood heated house. There's let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. There's 9 fireplaces to keep going here. People do not like their Gone with the Wind story to not be such a nice, tidy little story that they've been telling all their lives, or they've been told all their lives. I will say that any historical person, site, or event that you want to study, and really study thoroughly, you get down to the bottom of it, you really look at it, open up, look inside, look underneath. Rarely is it going to wrap up nice and pretty with a calico bow. It's going to have some seamy sides to it, not the history we learn at school. So I said, if you tell the story of the antebellum South and you do not include the narratives of the enslaved people who made that culture possible, then you're committing what I would call cultural genocide.
So that was Chilius Carter, one of the Behind the Big House co-founders, again, along with his wife and partner, Jennifer Eggleston. And thanks very much to Al Still and others with the Lens Collective who made that video possible. I think that, Chilius's frame of cultural genocide is very appropriate here in so many ways, and it can relate to a lot that we're, I think, in some ways being forced to engage in terms of what it means to have a shared history and a more holistic narrative that represents the lives of most Americans. And we think about this on a global scale as well. And what I've had the privilege of being able to do is, at least on a very small or micro scale, be able to dig deep into this kind of work because folks like Chilius and Jennifer were brave enough to start this type of program. And I do think that this work, I know that this work takes a certain amount of bravery for a variety of reasons. And not everyone understands this work. It's an all volunteer effort, which means that you tend to recruit and sustain people who really want to do it for the good of the work. And that's not always easy to do as well. But we've been lucky in that case to not only have them as homeowners, but people like David Person, who we unfortunately lost at the beginning of last year, and Genevieve Busby as well, and several others in the community. The program tends to happen once a year in April for the most part, and once a year in April because the program was intentionally started at the same time as one of the pilgrimages that I mentioned that tends to have started in the state around the 1930s in communities that were trying to think about how to develop tourism and use what they had in the sense of the built environment to be able to do that. And in many of these cases, they had these historic antebellum homes. So if you think about places like Natchez, for example, that had, I think, the earliest in the state, Holly Springs used Natchez as a model to do that and has continued to do that ever since. What Behind the Big House basically intersected was a moment in I think, the contemporary US where people really started to think about not just incorporating slavery as through National Park Service sites starting in the 1990s largely, and others that are related to founding families and such. But what does it mean to actually have sites that focus solely on the lives of the enslaved, not as a backdrop, not as a side tour, but as the priority? And we only have a few of those in the US. Some of you might be familiar with Whitney Plantation in Wallace or McLeod Plantation in South Carolina, for example. But for the most part, we get them as alternatives, not as the main focuses of the project. And that's what Behind the Big House is. Behind the Big House has had, I think, a lot of impact, certainly. Preserve Arkansas, the Historic Preservation Alliance of Arkansas, with the help of Dr. Jodi Barnes, who's a historical archaeologist, adapted the program. There's a Behind the Big House Arkansas. It's now also in a city in Columbus, Mississippi as well, fortunately. So it's spreading slowly but surely, I guess I should say, which was the hope. Chilius and Jennifer's main hope was that it would be a replicable model. Another unforeseen impact that we've had is that this particular program led to a couple of folks in Holly Springs realizing that thinking about history, thinking about slavery was one way to get Black and white folks in this particular part of Mississippi in the same room together to talk about their past in a relatively healthy way. And out of that came this racial reconciliation group gracing the table that Alicia Williams McLeod, who was then chair of humanities at Russ College, and David Person, who I mentioned earlier, co-founded along with some Russ College students. So I've largely been a scholar in collaboration with those two programs. So I've had that support system, but I've also fortunately been able to look at folks like Joby Hill and Andrea Roberts and realize that I'm a lot less alone than I thought that I was in this kind of work in so many ways. I heard about Joby's work, and then Ted Ownby, who was then director of the Center for the Study of Southern Culture, suggested that we invite her. And I tried to think about what might be the best moment in which to do that. And at that time, we were interpreting slavery through what was the Shigaga estate at Roanoke. Many of you might be familiar with Faulkner's home. And I was also working on best practices for interpreting slavery workshop, and thought that Joby would be a perfect person to help us, or to help guide us through the process of thinking through that. So I got to know Joby through that process. And with Andrea Roberts's work, I became familiar largely through folks who were working with her through her work in Shankleville, that I'm sure she'll talk about in a bit. But my dissertation project was on the St. Paul United Methodist Church in the Dallas Arts District. And part of that work was exhibiting archaeological materials and creating a historical narrative, or public historical narrative, for that church. And several of the folks who were helping me with that project were descendants of Shankleville in Newton County, Texas. One is Laretha Clay, who was then on the Texas Historical Commission. I'm sure she's still involved with it, but I found out about Andrea Roberts' work with Freedom Colonies through her. So again, I'm so happy to be here, happy that other folks are watching, and also happy to introduce first Joby Hill, who will talk about her work, and then Andrea Roberts.
All right, thank you, Jodi. I'm very excited to be part of this. Yeah, so I will get started. All right. So my personal mission is to advance an evidence-based understanding and acknowledgement of the institution of slavery in America. A cornerstone of this effort is the belief that the histories of many non-white Americans have been told to them and not by them. To that end, I am dedicated to the interpretation and preservation of the living and working environments of enslaved people, integrated with their own oral histories and historical records related to the business of slavery. For the last 10 years, I've been working hard to give a voice to those intentionally excluded voices in history. In doing so, also helping to expose wider audiences to different perspectives and preservation. I started an independent project titled Saving Slave Houses to ensure that slave houses were not lost forever. I also created the Slave House Database, a comprehensive national architectural and anthropological survey of slave houses. The goals of the project are to, 1, facilitate projects committed to the preservation and education of the history of enslaved people in the United States, to identify the importance of house as insight into enslavement, to set standards and shape future scholarship, and to act as a new comprehensive resource for people to connect and learn about their enslaved ancestors and the houses they lived and worked in during slavery. As part of my ongoing research, I complete architectural and anthropological surveys of slave houses in the United States to include in the Slave House Database. This documentation identifies and records current issues surrounding the preservation and interpretation of slave houses. Since 2012, I've seen over 700 buildings at more than 150 sites across 7 states and driven over 10,000 miles. The goals of my survey work are to, 1, identify the extant slave houses, 2, to document the current conditions, 3, to record architectural features and undocumented buildings, and 4, to collect GIS data. Technology plays an important role in the documentation of slave houses and is also an invaluable storytelling tool, one that engages and challenges the next generation of historians. I use technology to explore the intersections between the built environment, history, humanities, community, and technology, with the hope to yield captivating digital humanities projects. And this is just a short film that I made with Trimble about how we use technology to tell stories about slave houses. Oops, sorry. There we go. I've been fortunate to work with descendants of enslaved communities to explore the what and how of storytelling at historic sites of slavery. This summer, Saving Slave Houses partnered with Virginia Humanities to host a 12-week program called the Virginia Black Public History Institute. It had 10 participants that were descendants of sites of slavery in Virginia and 5 interns from primarily HBCUs to help assist with the research and the projects. And the 12 weeks were to explore public history through weekly readings, virtual roundtable discussions, hands-on learning, and engagement with professionals, policymakers, and government officials. The ultimate goals were to remove barriers, equip descendant communities with cutting-edge scholarships, tools, and other resources, and to provide a national support network. And here is what the participants thought of the Institute in their own words.
So far, it's been really cool to visit the plantations and see just how history has worked its way through Virginia.
Joby Hill. We are here for the 2021 Virginia Black Public History Institute, also known as the Descendant Workshop.
I thoroughly am enjoying the workshop because of all of the great research and history that I did not know. And I'm able to utilize that in my research for my relatives.
Doing this workshop, it feels like I'm getting pieces back of me.
Doing these site visits, and for many of the descendants, visiting these sites will be the first time they've had the opportunity to visit these sites. I hope it's an opportunity for them just be able to experience these places firsthand and really be able to make a connection. It's already incredibly personal because it is their family that they are researching and learning about.
One word to describe my experience with the Descendant Workshop is proud.
Empowered.
Grateful.
Grounding.
Humility.
So one of the best parts about participating in the Descendants Workshop has been being able to share in this experience with other descendants.
It's great to finally be able to step foot and, kind of try to retrace your ancestors' steps while they were here.
It's a lot of mixed emotions.
This is part of my heritage too, so I appreciate her having this space here because it helps preserve my heritage as well.
I really feel that it's important, for more Black Americans to reclaim these sites. There's obviously been a lot of trauma and a lot of pain that's occurred here. At the same time, the fact that we still exist and we've survived shows the resilience of our ancestors.
All right, so that is my project in a nutshell. And I will now hand it over to Andrea so she can tell you about the exciting work she's doing.
Thank you so much, Joby. I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this discussion and to be working in a tradition of these incredible women who are trying to make the invisible in our landscapes, in our public discourse, visible to everyone. And my work in much that same tradition is about making invisible contributions to the built environment, to planning and preservation projects or practice visible. So let me get started with a presentation. So the name of my project is, of course, the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. And I begin with this jarring image or set of images because it's very important in looking at the work that I'm doing with historic African-American settlements founded between 1865 and 1930, roughly in Texas, that a lot of these communities were founded in the specter of violence. And we, of course, are familiar in Jasper County, Texas, which is an area also known as Deep East Texas, that the dominant narrative of places such as these in the present is about the persistence of racial violence, notably the James Byrd dragging death in Jasper County. So that's what you see on one side of the screen is the site of that murder, of that hate crime. But what you see on the other side of the screen is actually in the same place. Huff Creek Memorial Chapel, which is formerly a Rosenwald school, is actually facing that same road where you see he was dragged. But what we don't hear in the public realm is about the fact that Huff Creek was an African-American community founded by formerly enslaved people. So it wasn't just that he was murdered, dragged to death with chains behind a truck down a back road, but that road, Huff Creek Road, anchored a community, a settlement. And so we have a coexisting history of perseverance, of creation of free Black space, coinciding with places of racial violence and destruction. And it is that complexity about the nature of space and the history of race and place in the United States that my research is preoccupied with. And as was previously mentioned, let me just move this. What was previously mentioned is my connection with Jodi is through a woman named Loretha Clay, who lives full-time in Dallas, Texas, but traces her roots back to a community known as Shankleville Community, located in Newton County, which is just adjacent to Jasper County. So we have a kind of shared culture here of places that don't have a reputation of being about Black freedom, but more so being about repression and danger and violence. And once I was invited out to Shankleville during a cultural festival, I learned so much, not just about their current ways that they celebrate, but about the roots of the community, which are part of a wonderful story that they use to anchor their work, to anchor their preservation work, to catalyze involvement and draw the entire diaspora folks back to the settlement each year in a homecoming, as well as biannually in reunions. And what's significant about this story is that it involves two formerly enslaved people who were actually enslaved first in Mississippi. That's Jim and Winnie Shankle. Winnie Shankle was sold away to a master in Texas and at a plantation that was located just next to where Harold Odom is standing at the bottom there at that spring. And Jim Shankle found his way to that spot. He swam 3 great rivers as a fugitive slave and reunited with Winnie at that spot, where they later settled and purchased land and created Shankleville. So it is a story of love, of perseverance, of a maroon community essentially founded in the middle of the deep East Texas woods, and is that story that anchors the work of Shankleville. And at these community events, I mentioned annual homecomings, it's not just to celebrate that story and people related to them, but to celebrate the entire region through a network of folks who also hold homecomings. And it's these practices, these networks, this storytelling tradition that I document. So when I first started going to this community and learning about the way they leverage story and the ways that others leverage story, I had no idea that would in any way shape the rest of what I do. But one of the things that happened as a consequence of interviewing, living with folks, talking to folks, was that I began to learn that there were several African-American settlements that were not documented anywhere as such. So when I started doing the work, interviewing, living with people, oral history interviews, ethnography, case studies, I thought there were only about 14 settlements. But I soon found that there were more like 36. So this shows you that without the counter narratives, without the voices of African Americans talking about landscapes and place, you really don't have the full understanding of our footprint in America and our capacity to plan and create places. And so after doing all that research, I learned that the descendants that I was working with were not just interested in having another scholar tell their story, but they wanted to get across that they were living communities with living concerns and agendas. They wanted a centralized location for their information. They wanted partnerships with institutions of higher learning. They wanted to develop a learning community, wanted practical assistance. They wanted to learn about how to preserve their heritage. They wanted a separate economically sustainable organization. They wanted public policy and legislative agenda. And I was simply a doctoral student at the time. And of course, didn't have the capacity to do those things, but I did have the capacity, or have over the past few years, focused on the first 3. The location, the centralized location, the partnerships, and learning community. And that's what the Texas Freedom Colonies Project is. We connect and collect place-making and place-keeping stories and histories. We counter-map and secure data that makes visible these communities. And we co-create with communities and with students research that generates solutions or makes visible the disparities in support and the nature of the threats to the continuation of freedom colonies. So the Texas Freedom Colonies Project first began as a way to express that this was a commitment on my behalf and not simply a study, to an educational social justice initiative dedicated to preserving Black settlements landscape, the heritage, and grassroots practice through participatory research, with the intent being mapping, documenting, identifying every single historic Black settlement in Texas, but doing it in a way that centered reciprocity. So we do it in a few different ways. We grow capacity, we build community through the co-research, we document these places, we assess current conditions, we have an Adopt a County program. So we're very participatory, and we're very much about education. This is a depiction of our most public-facing item, which is the online map, the Texas Freedom Colonies Project Atlas and Study, in which the public is invited to add not only a point and a story, but also images and documentation. These are images of some of the communities we've been working with over the past year and a half. So we've been working in Washington County, Texas, with an oral history workshop as they develop their own museum exhibit. We've been working with Jobie Hill Community, which is attempting to both preserve buildings and make their community come alive again. And then we have Centerline and Somerville, in which students are learning not only how to document and assess the conditions of cemeteries, but also to learn about the greater community and those interred there, as well as the state's involvement in submerging some of those cemeteries underneath reservoirs and lakes. So here's the impact of our work. It's a lot of numbers, it's a lot of policy, but I think the greater impact is understood through one of our partners, Ms. Gloria Smith. And so I'm going to stop share first, and then I'm going to share a short video to tell you about one of our volunteers. Let me share again. There we go.
It's important that people know because it existed. And if we don't talk about it, then it's going to disappear. I am a descendant of the freedom colony called Tunis, which is located in Burleson County, Texas. Right after the Civil War, in Texas, there were like 250,000 slaves. What their ambition was to be a landowner.
Building their own communities would create areas where they could, one, accumulate property and capital. They could develop and build institutions such as churches or schools, and numbers brought safety.
They went to the fringes of the plantation. They went to the floodplains where the whites were not looking. So that's where they settled. And it was always centered around a church. The church was the anchor.
Every Sunday, didn't care how packed the church was, my grandmother would have us on the front line. They'll say, Sister Davis, give us a good prayer. And she would get down there and she would pray and say, Lord, let all of my motherless children be grown. And we all were grown.
Very often for Texas Freedom Colonies, their institutions suffer. There's not the money or the people nearby to attend to it. And so it deteriorates. And as it deteriorates, it creates even more problems that often make it impossible to bring it back from the brink of destruction.
Freedom colonies have disappeared. There are places in my research where I've learned that there's nothing there anymore. If we don't do anything, the developers are going to come and build right over it. They're going to pour concrete right over it, as though we never existed.
This year, 2019, marks the 400th anniversary of the first Africans being brought to the shores forcibly. Our story doesn't begin and end there.
It wasn't in that bad a shape the last time that she was down here.
And in order for us to know who we truly are beyond that date and that moment, we have to tell ourselves and record our own stories of who we really are. The Texas Freedom Colonies Project started and is still dedicated to creating a place to hold stories, foundational stories of how these places were created. We want to know what are the ways that people on the ground are preserving the buildings remaining there, and what do people need to continue to preserve the heritage in the place.
Just like you see us now, we would be at the church like this on a random Sunday. You know, we might say, okay, everybody cooking a dish and we all just there laughing, talking. I want our youth to get that conversation and that teaching to let them know where they come from and where we struggle to get to and how far we done came.
What matters to me most is my obligation to people like Gloria who need to feel, frankly, that they're not alone. And I hope that will inspire them to keep on going and help them get the resources they need to do the work.
We want to keep something like this as a memorial to tell a story, to tell our story to America. It needs to be told. It should never die.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Jodi and Joby. There's a really, really amazing and powerful work. And I so appreciate your being able to show us pieces of it through just really powerful video. So thank you for that. I wanted to give you a chance, now that you've shown us some of what you've been doing, I wanted to ask you to kind of walk us through your processes a bit. So you all come from very different disciplines. And I'm curious to know how you go about doing your research. What kinds of questions are driving it early in the process, and how do you begin to investigate these sites or these communities when they come to your attention? And you can go in any order that you want, or answer something else if that's not a good question for now.
I don't mind starting, but I will start with one of Andrea's quotes that her work was about commitment, not about a study. And I think that's how I framed my work as well. When I got to the University of Mississippi in 2011, I realized that people weren't, as I said before, addressing slavery on the landscape, not in any complicated way. And when I heard that there were a couple of people doing that, I felt like it was my responsibility as someone who made that critique to help them out. And that project ended up being a reciprocal one in the sense that my students were able to work as docents or as guides during the slavery interpretation program. So they get historical narratives, and then they help share stories about the enslaved people at these different historic sites. And they're sites of urban slavery, which is something that I should have pointed out earlier, which is also, I think, very significant because so many people aren't accustomed to what urban slavery looks like. We think rural in the pop culture narrative. So I didn't go in with a set of particular research questions or anything of that sort. I came in to help. And I didn't know, I never interpreted slavery. I didn't know what it was like to come in to help and do that kind of work. Chilius and Jennifer, Joe McGill didn't know either, but Joe McGill knew more than the rest of us. And then we brought in Afro-culinary historian and chef Michael Twitty, who had done a lot of this work on historic plantation sites, thinking about foodways and how to make that information accessible to public. So a lot of what I learned was about, a lot of how I learned was by watching in working with people. And it's the same with the racial reconciliation work. I learned a lot by just doing it, by talking to people, by being candid, by being honest and open about my life experiences and about how that might help me understand other people's and what that means in terms of racial repair. Because for me, that's what a lot of this work is about. You have built environments, but this work, I think, at its core is about us understanding that people who were oppressed in the past still are in so many ways. And the historic preservation community participates in that oppression in many ways. And we're doing a lot of vindicationist work, I think, around that. And I knew that, and that's something that I wanted to understand better. So I guess maybe my research in that sense was more about understanding before I came to come up with any types of questions.
If I could follow up similarly, yes, it's about commitment, but I think my work is much more about power. And what I mean by that is changing the dynamic, especially in historic preservation or public history, in which in comes the expert or the scholar to come into a particular setting and say, hi, I'm the expert, and I'm going to determine what's of value and what's not of value. And you are supposed to feel community member, descendant community member, really privileged that I've decided to come and tell your story for you. And that was a dynamic that I witnessed and I saw repeated and that I did not want to be a part of. And so a lot of my interactions were, just like Jodi said, a posture of humility and learning in these communities. And I did that for a year before I came up with any research question, which was about the nature of oral traditions and the role of oral traditions in actually mobilizing formerly the descendants of formerly enslaved people who started these communities, how stories were utilized to mobilize, organize, and actually address problems. So it's that old knowledge to action question was fundamentally what I was interested in. So my initial question was not how do I map 557 places, it was how do I learn about the nature of these places and the nature of how memory is transferred, how knowledge is transferred. And that made me focus in on the oral tradition and experience. And I just do want to quickly acknowledge Dr. McGee's comment about 1619 and about 1528. And I did note in the video, forcibly brought to the shores is the differentiation. We know that there are other Africans prior to 1619 who came to the shores of the United States, but forcibly, in what's notable and known, and especially at the time of that video in 2019 was 1619.
Yeah, so I mean, like the other shoe women, so I think there's kind of two different ways I approach the work. There's one of the documentation that I do, which is really just to identify as many sites as possible and gather information about them before they disappear, right? Because when you're dealing with slavery and like slave houses, the first kind of preservation question is, well, what do we have, right? You can't really do a project because people want to know, well, what do we have? And so, then, how fast are they disappearing? Well, if we can't answer that question, then it gives people an excuse to just not, move these projects forward. So that was really one of my main goals, is to be able to help answer that question, right? So what's out there? What condition are they in? And so it really is just kind of do it as fast as possible and make that known to people so they know that there really are these structures and sites out there that need to be preserved and are worth preserving. And then, like the other two said, but when I dig deeper into research in a site, my goal and from the beginning was, and my hope was that at some point descendants of enslaved communities would reach out to me. That I wasn't going to reach out to them. I was going to wait for them to reach out to me when they were comfortable and I would be able to help them. And so that finally happened. And that's the most exciting part for me, is because the work I'm doing, I want to be able to help them learn more about their families and their research, and help provide resources for them that I know about or might have access to that they don't, because I know how difficult it is to do research in a special collections when they're only open Tuesday and Thursday from 2 to 4. Okay, that's not the real world. Like, if you're a normal person, you have a job and you're working those times, and so you're not able to do the same research as, if you were a student or something like that. And so it is really, what really drives me is just to see them and help them learn more about their own histories. Because, it's their stories to be told, and they're the ones that should be doing it, not me. So I'm just there to help in any way I can.
I wonder if I can ask you all, well, first I want to point out there are lots and lots of congratulatory and complimentary messages in the chat for all of you. But also I wanted to pick up on that point that you just made, Joby, and tie it back to some of Andrea and Jodi's earlier points. And talking about this tension or dichotomy between these stories of oppression and stories of community resilience, and between invisibility and, I guess, living memory in many ways. So I wonder if you could all say more about this commitment that you all clearly have to working with descendant communities, working with young people, in many ways working with people for whom this history is already meaningful. And yet you also are all driven by this desire to tell bigger stories to broader public audiences beyond that, in a sense that these are stories that other people who don't know about them need to know. So how do you think about who the audiences, who the publics, who the communities are, who are really at the center of that work, and doing it in a way that also reaches out beyond that to people who don't have any idea that these sites exist or that these histories matter?
I can start. For me, from my formal education, I felt like there's always a lot of information that was missing, that I was being taught about, like slavery, and also the amount of information that I was being told that existed out there. So once I started doing field work and really seeing all these buildings and doing some research about it, I realized there's so much more out there than what I was being told. And in a little ways, I was angered by it, because this is like, I had been to school and gotten degrees about this, but I was being told one thing, but when I actually went out there and did it myself, it was something completely different. And it was so much more meaningful to me when I started uncovering things myself and realizing there are people out there that know a lot about this history, and there's documentation of it. That's really kind of what drives me, because I just know it's when people say, oh, there's not really anything out there, that's just not true. And so, so the more kind of ways I share that or tell people about that, I also see how kind of excited they get about it, right? And so that's who my audience is varies from just, literally day to day, but it's always kind of the same goal, is to expose what's really out there and hopefully get them as excited about it as I am, to learn about all the wonderful and amazing things that these people did. And so that's yeah, I mean, that really is just what drives me.
I think a lot in my work about strategic visibility. And so that helps me think about audiences. So for example, I'm in urban planning. I'm not in a humanities field. And urban planning is, intersects with transportation, infrastructure planning, development. And so being strategically visible in those contexts is about the fact that these communities, if they're not visible, if they don't have an organized resistance or visibility before decision makers, practitioners, cultural resource managers, then they're endangered, which is ironic because most freedom colonies were founded in areas or in ways that were meant to be secret and not seen. But their choice about their visibility is they don't have as much choice anymore. So usually my audience is not just, hey, here's this platform for descendant communities to add to, and also to see that they're not alone. Yes, that's definitely an audience, but it's also archaeologists, those who are doing Section 106 historic preservation reviews of infrastructure projects or any federally funded project, so that in the course of doing this planning, they have to think differently about who's a stakeholder, which places matter, and which places may have endangered properties there. And so what the Atlas has become for, of all people, Texas Department of Transportation, which is often the problem, is now you've got a few folks inside who are using the Texas Freedom Colonies Project Atlas before they go out into the field. It's part of the desktop reviews. Small step, and I cannot claim to have saved a cemetery, but it's really, that's what I mean by sort of strategic visibility, is how are we infiltrating these processes or finding the fissures so that we can shape how people examine or look at the landscape and what they value in the landscape, and frankly, give them less excuses not to see it.
Thanks for the question, Annie. I think it's a really interesting question because I was trained to think a lot about identifying communities, and I haven't had to do much of that in my work. I think it's been more of an organic process, especially working with Behind the Big House in Holly Springs. In one sense, the program was developed, and to some extent, the hope was that African Americans would participate or come. And, that's not how things work. I've heard that a lot in archaeology. Well, we've done this work for Black people. Where are they? It's the build it and they'll come mentality. And, I think what happened in Behind the Big House is that the Behind the Big House program developers created a space relatively safe enough for Black people to want to come to it. And I think you have to be very thoughtful. And I think that you have to work really hard. It's a lot of hard emotional work, I think, more than anything else, to be able to do that. And most of the homeowners are white in this particular case, which means to some extent they have to be extraordinary white people to be able to do this. And, I don't like to think of them that way because I want to be hopeful that more white people can do this kind of work, but I do think that to some extent they've had to do a lot of internal personal work to create spaces welcoming enough for Black folks to want to come to. And you're not going to get all of them. That's not the goal, but you want it to be accessible to those who want to come. And what happened in one of these particular cases is that Burton Place, which is one of the historic properties, which was owned by David Person, there was a woman named Deb Davis, who is from Illinois. Her ancestry is in Holly Springs, where the homes are, and she knew her family's genealogy. She had done a lot of genealogical research. She knew that her ancestors were enslaved by the woman who owned this historic property during the antebellum period. She saw that the side door was open at the house, and this is a story that she tells in one of the Lens Collective videos. So I suggest that folks take a look at the link that was in the chat. And she went to David's house and she essentially said, I think that my ancestors were enslaved by Mary Burton, who owned this property, and he just opened his arms and said, come on in. And I think that's the type of work that it takes. And on the other hand, we've had the privilege of having Linda Turner, who's a resident of Marshall County, who came to Behind the Big House just to check it out the first year to make sure that it was safe, a safe space. And the second year she came with 500 Marshall County students and has consistently done that each year since. So I do think, for that reason, it's been a bit more organic. And I'll just quickly say, to the point of invisibility, I think, this is something that Dr. Whitney Battle Baptiste wrote about in her Black Feminist Archaeology text. So a lot of, I think this work is innately linked to Black feminist thought in so many ways. And when she talks about how often being invisible in life gives you this particular lens through which to see invisibility. And I think that's been the case for me. I felt not invisible in my household or with my family, but I felt invisible in the city that I grew up with. My culture was not considered the dominant one in terms of historic preservation narratives. It was Cajun, not Black Creole, which I am. So I think that gives me that particular lens. I'm able to recognize invisibility in ways that other people aren't, and tend to advocate for it as a result.
Great. I'm going
I'd also, sorry, I just like to also add that I think we can all agree that when we do projects or work, whatever, is that it's collaborative. Like, it's not just us. Like we rely on other people with different backgrounds. Like Jodi does archaeology, Andrea does urban planning. Like, I'm an architect. Like, it takes so many different disciplines to make this happen, and it should. Like, it shouldn't be done by just one person, because no one has all that knowledge, right? And so all the projects we do, we're always collaborating together. And I mean, I've been on many different panels with, Andrew, like it's, you kind of get a circle, right? There are certain people that do this type of work, but, you rely on each other to not only provide like support, but also that knowledge. Like, you need their knowledge and expertise to get it done, because it takes a village, right? It takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of different perspectives to make this happen.
Thank you. There are several questions that have come in, and so I'm going to try and fold in those questions now, give you a chance to address some of them. Joby, there was a question that came in for you asking if you could talk some more about your workshops. And I think I would broaden this out too, to invite Andrea and Jodi to respond as well. So the question was, how do your workshops reach an audience of such different ages? Who were the kids in the classroom in your video? How do they relate to the grown-ups in the annual workshop? How did they achieve the deep understanding of the young participant who spoke first?
Yeah, so this comes back to collaborating. So for the video that I made with Trimble, so that one was focused in Colorado. And so we worked with one of the education, like, I don't know if they're called boards, but and teachers, to figure out what should be taught in the classrooms, right? Because for me, I don't know what a fifth grader should be learning, right? So we rely on the teachers giving their input and creating the curriculum for them. So again, that's collaborating to have them to make that happen. For the workshop, so that last year was the pilot program, the first year that we did that. And it went really well. And when we did it, we did invite, for the workshop, they were all adults. But once we did the site visits with them, one of the men brought his son with him, which is why there is because he had never been to Virginia to visit the site before. And so he wanted to bring his son. And we said, of course, that's fine. And we told all the participants, any family members that you want to bring, feel free. Like this experience is for you, right? And we're just there to, help you get access to it, and so we can have conversations about what you're seeing. And it worked really well. We kind of had our own ideas about, how it might go. Like we thought that each group would want to visit the site alone, right? Because it might have been a very emotional experience and they would want to do it alone just with their family. But it turns out all the participants wanted to go to all the sites, and they wanted to be there, to learn about the other sites and to talk with the group, to continue the conversations with the groups. So some of the assumptions we made were not true. But overall, I do think it was very successful, and we're hoping to do it again. And the next time around, we know more about kind of how to structure it so it can be as inclusive as possible.
I can say briefly about our workshops that they're often by request, and they're, I'd say, part of both our data collection as well as a principle of reciprocity. We don't simply come in and say, give me your information so we can make our pretty map. We say, look, here's why making this map and making you visible on it matters and meets, some of your goals and expectations. But while we're trying to get information, what are you trying to do in your community that we could support you in? And so often that's a workshop specifically about archival research in the public realm, meaning, I think it was mentioned a moment ago, collections, Joby was saying, the collections that are open from 2 to 4 in the afternoon, or collections that lay people don't have access to at all, then how is it that we can maybe make more materials available or steer them toward the right kind of online resources? And the other workshops, those are kind of the virtual workshops, but in person, we're teaching people to conduct oral histories. What are the ethics around that? What's the process? What's consent about? Sort of those kind of details, so that once we leave, they're not waiting on us to come back and always do oral histories for them. We're doing oral histories because they want them to be part of a museum exhibit, because the goal for Brenham area, Washington County, Texas, those local descendants of freedom colonies wanted a museum exhibit. And that was a way to not only say freedom colonies matter, but also how they can draw more descendants out in wanting to continue to be involved in heritage conservation. So our role was create the space, provide the support in the way of training. And then while they're giving that information, we're learning more about what freedom colonies that we didn't even know about. And, we got recently 2 more mapped through that process, for example. So that's sort of how we look at kind of formulating our workshop strategy, so to speak.
Thank you.
I can't really speak to younger people or children as a workshop audience because I haven't done much of that. Most of the workshops that I've done have targeted historic preservation professionals more broadly. And what I've done in those cases, I think, is really try to help organizations and individuals think about what they value. So I think that if you ask almost any historic preservationist if they think that we should be preserving African-American heritage and historic sites, they would tell you, yes, of course. But if you ask them to think about what they prioritize in terms of their values, then they have to think a bit more critically about that. So what I tend to do is give them a list of values, like money, economics for one, stakeholders, my local board, those types of things. And I ask them to put them in order of priority. And if your order of priority is finances, which is understandable to some extent, then that's really going to compromise your community engagement. So you have to think about how those things are related to each other. So for the most part, that's what I've been working on.
So Jodi, there was another question for you and asking you to talk about how your institution has supported or resisted your community action research. And Andrea, this seems like a particularly relevant question for you as well in terms of thinking, also working with methods that are probably outside the typical methods for your discipline.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I don't think that my university understood my work in any capacity. And I think that it's really hard work to understand if you haven't done it. And I think that a big part of the bias, at least in academia, more specifically in my institution, is that our research is equated with being able to publish things. And when you do slow community engaged research, the publications don't come as quickly as they might in other cases because you're working with people. Sometimes I was on the phone for 15 hours a week, right? That's very slow research. And a jewel might come out of one of those phone conversations. I know that, but explaining that to colleagues or to folks who think about tenure and promotion review is a very difficult thing to translate. So I struggled a whole lot with trying to advocate for myself, trying to advocate for my work within the context of these boundaries of tenure and promotion. It didn't work for me. It just didn't. I did the community work anyway, and it took an emotional and physical toll on my health in all kinds of ways. There's no other way to get around that. I was able to publish, I still did that, and that's what got me tenure and promotion for the most part. The community work got recognized at particular university levels in my department with some administrators. I think for the most part after it got recognized nationally through a Whiting fellowship, but it was a struggle for many years prior to that.
I can say that, in the field of urban planning, there's still a tendency toward the quantitative and rational planning, as it's called. And so while there is this emphasis on social practice and design and charrettes and all these wonderful things, this low, long exploratory research in which you're working with communities to determine what they believe the problem is, what they've experienced the problem to be, is still antithetical to where's the National Science Foundation grant that will, help us build a data set that we can then get millions of dollars for and just propagate the same research. All very important. But I think what's been important for me is much like Jodi just said was I had to think about what I was saying with my work that wasn't just about, I hate to say just about freedom colonies, but was about our field of urban planning. How was it about historic preservation? And so when I was able to do that, I was able to produce the articles because I'm in the article field. They care nothing for books. And so those were kind of the ways that I was able to situate my work and also explain to my institution why my work mattered. And also Paula Gerstenblatt, she's a scholar out of University of Southern Maine. And I kind of watched her engage in research. And she would always say, as she was doing this very engaged, social, arts-based practice, she'd say the relationships, the practice is the research. And she would write about the practice, she would write about the relationships, and she would find the journals that would take it. And so that's also my principle is I write about the process. I write about the relationships, and I write about teaching students to understand how to do this work. And it's hard and exhausting, to be honest. It's not always easy. It's not easy at all.
Joby, I don't know if that's a question that's as relevant for you in terms of thinking about pushing back around institutional structures, but I'm sure that the larger question about the emotional costs of doing this work is relevant. So I don't know if you want to say anything to that.
Yeah, so I will say I have been, or I consider myself fortunate that and this was also purposeful to not be like in academia doing like the teaching where you need tenure, because that I knew that was too restrictive for what I was doing. And I had to fight against that when I was in school. Granted, I am going back to school again, but that's okay because it has its benefits. But so I had the freedom to really do what I wanted to, right? And not have to worry about, publishing something. And also for me, I think for the work I'm doing, I don't think publishing is the best way to communicate what I'm doing, right? And so I didn't go down that road. But at the same time, I still run into the same problems that everyone else has, right? Is to have to kind of continuously explain to people why this is important, why it matters. And like Jodi touched upon earlier, working with different organizations, institutions, they want to interpret slavery, right? Or the African-American experience, but they don't know what that means. Like I'll ask them like, okay, but so what do you want to do? Like what's the project, whatever? Oh, they have no idea. It's because this is all so new to them that you have to work with them to help them figure out what they even want to do because they don't know. And so that's another part of it, which again, it's great that they're asking and not just assuming, right? So we are moving forward in that sense. And I, of course, were more than willing to give my 2 cents worth, right? So they don't, that's kind of one of the first parts of it. The second part is when I do like consulting work for projects, I've found that when it comes to like the budgets, it's grossly just miscalculated because these structures, when you're dealing with a physical structure, and usually it needs some type of stabilization, restoration, something like that, because enslaved people are associated with it, they think it's going to be cheaper and faster to do than any other building on the site. And that just blows my mind because that just doesn't make sense, right? A building is a building. And if you let it decay and it's in really bad shape, then it's going to take more time and more money to repair it, even though there were enslaved people occupying it, right? And they would never do that for the other, and they don't for the other buildings on the site. But it just shows kind of how ingrained that is in our thinking, that even today, that this should be cheaper and faster because back then the people didn't matter and all labor was free, that it will just carry over today. So I also have to explain to them why that's not true.
So let me pick up on that and connect it to a question, and I'm going to kind of combine or throw together several different questions. So somebody has asked about public libraries. I am not sure what the question is, but perhaps if there are ways that you've interacted with public libraries and doing your research. And then there was a question, I guess, for all of you. Any tips or hints on how your research and work intersects with funding, spending, and local budgets? Seems to be challenging to ensure that the economic decisions and investments align to support this important work.
I could speak to the money part, if that's okay, if I could start there.
Yes.
I think that, of course, it's all about creativity, right? Or making do. And part of that creativity, I think I've learned from descendant communities who do a few different things. For example, there's one descendant community in Jasper County in a place called Dixie, Freedom Colony. And they determined that since they were making their public space available for annual events that were drawing people to the county, so they were using their segregation era school gym for reunions, for quinceañeras, for all types of public cultural events to kind of pay the bills, and sustain other projects they wanted to do there. Well, because they were drawing people to the community, they also figured that they should have access to hot funds, which are, hotel occupancy taxes. So then they thought, well, why don't we go and make an argument to the local city council, to the county, and say, look, you know, we have been able to bring in over the last year this many people to Jasper County for celebrations, what have you, at this location, even from other counties. And so that means we're bringing people to use the hotel. So might we be able to get a percentage of those taxes? So it's about, you know, being able to start quantifying what you're doing. And it's quantifying is not always just, you know, numbers, but sometimes it is. Sometimes it's a matter of, you know, all these people would not be here if not for our place, our festival, this action that we're doing. So I think it's about, again, Jodi's question, what she was saying about, you know, value, and then being able to communicate that to people who will hold control of the coffers.
So I can jump in real quick about libraries, since there's not really an exact question there. But I have been making an effort and reaching out to many libraries. And I did this for the Descendant workshop program specifically, because again, to find information about enslaved people, it's going to be in family papers, right? Just like you learn about the white family, you're going to learn about the enslaved people in the family papers. And those are the ones that people don't have access to. They're not digitized, you know, and so that's a big problem. And so I have been reaching out to libraries to see if they will make an effort to digitize their collections and make them publicly available to people so that people can do research and be able to not have to, you know, sift through papers or go during certain times, whatever. And so that's how I've been working with libraries, is asking them to prioritize certain papers or collections so that everyone has access to the same type of information to do research about their families.
So there was also a question, and I think this goes back to the conversation about institutional support or resistance. There's a question asking, do you think your work, this work, would matter if you were at an HBCU?
I think it depends on the HBCU. I mean, there are a variety of responses to that, certainly. And we have in Holly Springs, Rusk College is an HBCU, and the students in Rusk College are the students who co-founded the Racial Reconciliation Group. One of the sustainable issues there is that students come and go, of course, and a lot of that work was largely dependent on one professor and not necessarily a department. And a lot of HBCUs don't have departments outside of history departments, like anthropology, where they might train a historical archaeologist, or public history, although, you know, Tuskegee and a few others have it, are either minor programs. Now, I think it's growing to some extent in this moment, that really make the institutional capacity for it a bit different. So I think that it really depends on the HBCU and who's there. I think that it's really, beneficial for historically white institutions to reach out and collaborate in those ways, because I think that training students at HBCU will cause them to train other students at a particular point. And I think that that's where that has to start. If I knew that there was something such as plantation archaeology when I was at an HBCU, I would have probably majored in it, but it didn't exist. So, and it, in most cases, they don't, outside of Howard. So, you know, there are many, I think, structural issues to think about in those cases.
I will say there's a tremendous amount of attention in not only this presidential administration, but the previous one, on being able to sort of say, if we want to invest in African-American historic preservation or sites, let's go to HBCUs. So there has been an increase in funding allocation, which incentivizes wherever the money is. It's often where people begin to say, well, maybe I will engage in that. With good reason. There are incredible structures at places like Houston-Tillotson, Prairie View University, which is part of the Texas A&M system where I work. And so I think we're going to increasingly see people wanting to work on HBCU campuses, some of which were adjacent to plantations in some instances, in which you'll begin to see, truth and reconciliation commissions and race and study centers and things of that nature, I think are going to arise because there is that federal funding available to support preservation, adding to the National Register of Historic Places, identifying potential listings or properties that might be listed, particularly at HBCUs. So I think that may begin to shift all of our attention there more and more in the coming years.
And in the state of Mississippi, we also have comparable work being done at Tougaloo in Jackson, and as well as Jackson State, where you have a lot of civil rights related sites. So there are a lot of individuals doing that work with their students. I do think that structural development is still probably an issue. To Andrea's point, that the allocation of funds is going to be a serious issue, or that conversation really needs to be had across the board.
Mm-hmm. So Andrea, there are a couple of questions, and I'm going to need to ask you to make this short, but there are a couple of questions that have come in of people wanting to know a little more about the history of freedom communities.
Sure, I can say that for one thing, they go by several different names. You may have heard freedmen's towns, freedmen's settlements, Black settlements. I've heard Black pockets. And the overarching term that I use is freedom colonies, not because I support colonization, but because in my estimation, what African Americans were doing when they created historic Black settlements in Texas between 1866 and 1930 is they were territorializing freedom in unfree space. A different notion of colonization than we normally think, but I argue that's what it is, just the same. And these are intentional communities with predominantly clusters of landowners, usually on plots of land nobody else wanted, in environmentally endangered places, and often near rail lines, predominantly in rural areas, but not exclusively. So that's what freedom colonies are. And I'll put a link in the chat.
Thank you. Great. And I think we have time for one more question, although this is a question that is worthy of much more time than we're going to be able to give it. But a question came in asking, how do you share with people who you have learned through conversations that they are against preservation? So I hate to end on having you all talk about resistance, but do you have any strategies to share?
I say I can speak at least from the work I do. So when I'm doing field work, going out and visiting these sites in person, if I get resistance, I have figured out it's because one, the property owners don't want to be judged for having these structures on their property. And also, if they are a public site, they don't want really negative attention for this, right? They don't want to draw attention to what they already have. And so for me, I make a real effort to let them know that when I'm there to do documentation, that's what I'm there for. I'm not there to judge them. And we don't even have to have a conversation if you don't want. Like some property owners say, there are the buildings. When you're done, you can just go. Great, that's fine. Others, we sit down and we'll talk for hours, right? So it really does vary, but I make it very clear that I am not there to judge. Like I realize that slavery happened in the past, right? But I'm there to document so I can help preserve these structures. And the same is kind of true with like institutions. Like if you can prove to them that embracing these stories is a good thing and you're going to get a lot of good attention for it, then they're more willing to give more resources to her project, is what I found.
Yeah, that's always a tough one. I think, I don't come across many people who are broadly resistant to preservation per se, although, I've worked in some places where that tends to dominate in many ways, where you have a lot of development especially. But I think when we're thinking specifically about sites of slavery, I do think a lot of what Joby Hill is saying resonates in that there's a lot of guilt around that for people. Even with civil rights movement sites in the state of Mississippi, where there's some property owners who prefer that the sites just fall apart so that the story goes away. That's the hope. The site goes away, the story goes away. And that's why I think that this work and racial reconciliation have to happen at the same time. I think that somehow those folks have to be held accountable for the disproportionate amount of power that they have. In many cases, that's what happens. Or they've got to be brought into this conversation about racial repair work, shifting it away from white guilt, which I think people tend to stay stuck in.
I'll just say briefly that the threats are very much about destruction and about undermining control of land, with Freedom Colonies. So it may not be a discussion about, oh, this is an uncomfortable racial issue, but how is this space or land that people think that they can take advantage of, that they can steal, that they can put intrusive development on? And so a lot of that goes back to strategic visibility in spaces where people are talking about or actually have the power to make decisions about what gets built and not built. And that's where we try to interject our education as well, our educational material in the Atlas.
Thank you. We are out of time, and I want to thank you all again and encourage you to look at the chat if you haven't, because as I said before, it's full of praise and compliments for the work that you are all doing. So thank you again, Jodi, for sharing your work with us in your book, as well as for helping to organize today's session. Joby, Andrea, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today and for sharing your work and your brilliance with us this afternoon. And Jodi's book is now out, and there is a discount code if you are interested in buying it. And thank you all again, and thanks to everybody who came and participated in today's conversation. It was really wonderful.